On the surface, this looked like a redistricting vote in Virginia, a ballot measure, a procedural adjustment, a technical decision about congressional maps that most people would normally scroll past without a second thought. But underneath that surface, this was something else entirely. This was a test. A test of whether voters would accept a system being reshaped without them, or step in before the lines were locked in place. Because this did not begin in Virginia. It began when Donald Trump pushed a redistricting strategy through Republican-controlled legislatures, particularly in Texas, with one clear objective: increase Republican seats in the House of Representatives without going through voters directly. No referendum, no statewide approval, just maps drawn, approved, and implemented through legislative power. And that's the part that matters. Because when representation is adjusted without direct public input, the outcome isn't just a new map, it's a shift in power, quiet, procedural, but deeply consequential. Now contrast that with what happened here. In Virginia, the map didn't stay behind closed doors, it was put on the ballot, it was debated in public, it was explained, challenged, and ultimately decided by voters themselves. Abigail Spanberger didn't frame this as a partisan maneuver, she framed it as legitimacy, a process that required legislative approval twice, and then required something far more unpredictable: public consent. And that difference between a map imposed and a map approved is not technical, it's structural. Because the moment you ask voters to decide, you introduce risk, you introduce uncertainty, you introduce accountability. And that's exactly what this vote created. Now step back and look at the stakes. This wasn't just about Virginia gaining or losing a few congressional seats. Analysts have already pointed out that this redistricting could result in as many as 4 additional Democratic seats in the House. 4 seats. That's not a local adjustment, that's a potential shift in national control. Because control of the House of Representatives is not symbolic. It determines who sets the agenda, who controls committees, and most importantly, who holds subpoena power. And subpoena power is where oversight begins. It's where investigations move from speculation to testimony under oath. That's why this moment matters, not because of the vote itself, but because of what it unlocks next. Listen carefully to what's being said and what isn't. Hakeem Jeffries didn't stand in front of cameras and promise impeachment. He didn't outline a specific investigation. He didn't name targets. Instead, he said something far more precise. Nothing is ruled in, nothing is ruled out. That's not a vague answer, that's a controlled signal. Because in Washington, when someone avoids committing to an outcome, it often means they are preserving the option. And preserving the option means preparing for the moment when that option becomes necessary. Now layer that over everything else happening at the same time: rising disapproval ratings, economic frustration, a war in Iran that is becoming harder to justify, and even voices that once supported Trump, like Tucker Carlson, beginning to publicly question their role in supporting him. This isn't one event. It's a pattern forming in real time. Patterns don't announce themselves. They build quietly, one decision at a time, until suddenly the direction becomes impossible to ignore. And if you line up the sequence here, Texas redistricting, Virginia referendum, shifting polling, internal fractures, you start to see something that looks less like isolated events, and more like a system under pressure. Now listen to how this was framed publicly. Barack Obama didn't talk about technical mapping formulas or demographic distributions. He kept it simple. Vote yes and push back. Not analyze, not debate. Push back. That choice of words matters, because push back assumes something is already pushing forward. And what was pushing forward was a strategy, one that relies on controlling the structure of elections rather than persuading within them. Now bring in what Abigail Spanberger said. She emphasized the process, twice approved by the legislature, then handed to the people. That sounds procedural, but look closer. She wasn't just defending a map, she was defending a method. A method that forces transparency, forces explanation, forces accountability. And that stands in direct contrast to what happened in Texas, where voters were never given that final say. So now we have 2 competing models operating inside the same country. One where political actors draw lines and implement them, and one where those same lines must survive public scrutiny before they exist. That's not just a policy difference, that's a legitimacy gap. Now switch gears. Because while this structural battle is unfolding, another layer is collapsing at the same time: public trust. Polling shows rising disapproval of Donald Trump across multiple fronts. Economic handling, cost of living, foreign policy decisions tied to Iran, Numbers matter here, not as opinions, but as indicators of stability. When disapproval climbs into the two-thirds range, you're no longer dealing with a divided electorate, you're dealing with erosion. And erosion doesn't stay contained. It leaks into allies, it leaks into messaging, it leaks into the ability to hold a coalition together. That's where Tucker Carlson becomes relevant, not as a personality, but as a signal. Because when someone who once amplified a message starts questioning it publicly, the impact isn't in what he says. It's in what it allows others to say. It lowers the cost of dissent. And once dissent becomes easier, it spreads faster than loyalty. Now layer that over what happened economically. Rising gas prices, rising rent, a voter in Florida grading the economy a D, maybe an F. That's not abstract dissatisfaction, that's lived experience. That's the moment when policy debates stop being theoretical and start becoming personal. And this is where the contrast sharpens. On one side, you have discussions about maps, seats, control of the House. On the other side, you have people struggling to afford daily life. Those two realities are happening at the same time. And when they collide, something breaks. And when that collision happens, the conversation shifts from politics to accountability. This is where tone changes. This is where the language stops being descriptive and starts becoming prosecutorial. Because once you connect the structure of power to the consequences people are living through, you're no longer just observing events, you're examining responsibility. Start with the timeline. Redistricting efforts escalate in Texas without a direct vote. That sets a precedent. Then Virginia responds by forcing the issue onto the ballot. That creates a public checkpoint. At the same time, polling data shows rising disapproval of Donald Trump across economic management, foreign policy, and cost of living. These are not isolated data points. They are concurrent signals. Now add the policy layer. A war posture toward Iran that includes shifting deadlines, public statements that contradict actions within the same day, and decisions that directly influence energy markets. Gas prices rise, transportation costs follow, food prices respond. This is not theoretical economics. This is cause and effect. Then examine the financial decisions. Tariffs imposed, later ruled illegal, now requiring refunds to American businesses, not foreign governments, not external actors. American companies paying upfront, borrowing to cover costs, and waiting for reimbursement. That sequence is documented. Court rulings confirm it. Refund systems are being processed. So now we have a pattern: structural control attempts, economic pressure, policy inconsistency, legal reversal. And in the middle of that pattern, you have statements. Statements like, "I don't want to do that," followed hours later by doing exactly that. Deadlines announced, then extended, positions declared, then reversed. This is not a one-time contradiction. This is a repeated behavior pattern. From a prosecutorial perspective, consistency matters, because consistency is what allows the public and institutions to rely on what is being said. When statements repeatedly disconnect from outcomes, the issue is no longer policy preference. It becomes credibility. Now bring that back to Congress. Hakeem Jeffries talks about oversight, about subpoenas, about accountability mechanisms that activate when control of the House shifts. He does not promise a specific action, but he makes clear that investigative authority will be used. That is not speculation. That is a statement of institutional function. And that's where the tension sharpens again. Because if the House changes hands, the same system that is currently being shaped through redistricting becomes the system that investigates how that shaping occurred. That is a closed loop of power. And closed loops create pressure. Pressure on decisions, pressure on messaging, pressure on alliances. Meanwhile, outside of Washington, the consequences continue. A business forced to lay off employees because of tariff costs, a family adjusting to rising rent, a worker watching gas prices climb while wages remain fixed. These are not statistics. These are outcomes. So now the contrast is no longer subtle. It is visible. A system adjusting its own rules, while people absorb the cost of those adjustments. And this is where the story stops being about strategy and becomes about consequence. Because once you move past the maps, past the votes, past the messaging, what you're left with is a simple, uncomfortable reality. People are paying the price for decisions they never directly approved. A business owner doesn't experience tariff policy. He experiences payroll cuts, delayed orders, and loans taken just to survive. A family doesn't debate foreign policy posture. They feel it when gas prices spike and groceries cost more every month. A worker doesn't track redistricting strategy. But that strategy determines who has the power to investigate, to regulate, or to ignore what's happening to him. That is the moral scene. On one side, a system adjusting lines on a map, calculating control of committees, preparing for oversight battles. On the other side, people adjusting their lives in real time, cutting expenses, delaying decisions, absorbing costs that keep moving in one direction. Same country, same moment, completely different realities. And when those two realities drift too far apart, trust doesn't just weaken, it fractures. Because trust depends on one core assumption, that the system operates under consistent rules that apply equally. But what happens when those rules feel flexible? When deadlines are announced and then moved, when policies are imposed and then reversed, when maps are drawn in one place without public input, and only challenged in another because voters intervened before it was too late. At that point, the question is no longer partisan, it's structural. Is the system still functioning as a framework people can rely on, or is it becoming something that adapts based on who is in control at a given moment? Because if power can redraw the field while the game is still being played, then outcomes aren't just determined by voters, they're influenced by whoever controls the process behind the scenes. And that's why what happened in Virginia matters beyond its borders. It wasn't just a vote about maps. It was a moment where voters stepped into the process itself, before it was finalized, before it was locked, before it quietly reshaped representation for years to come. A pause, a check, a signal. That the public is still capable of intervening when the system starts moving too far without them. But here's the question that remains. If intervention only happens in moments like this, visible, contested, high-stakes moments, what happens in all the moments that aren't? What happens to the decisions that never make it to a ballot? What happens to the rules that change quietly, without resistance, without visibility? And more importantly, if the law is applied when it's challenged, but flexible when it's not, is it still functioning as law, or is it becoming something conditional? That's the line this moment is forcing into the open. And if moments like this matter to you, if you care about how power is used, how systems operate, and how decisions affect real people, then stay with this conversation. Like the video, share it with someone who should be thinking about these questions, and subscribe because this isn't where it ends.